In Washington, a battle of wills over border security, with parts of the U.S. government facing possible shutdown by week's end. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The White House appeared to blink Tuesday in its standoff with Congress over a budget deal that would provide the $5 billion President Trump wants to fund a southern border wall.
We don't want to shut down the government. We want to shut down the border from illegal immigration. We have other ways that we can get to that $5 billion that we will work with Congress.
Now, that's a very different tone that we heard last week during a contentious meeting in the Oval Office with Democratic leaders. President Trump had said he was ready to leave the government without funds to operate if he couldn't get his money for his long-promised wall.
If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely. And I am proud, and I'll tell you what, I am proud to shut down the government for border security.
The relationship between the president and Congress might become even more difficult come January, when Democrats assume the majority in the House of Representatives. So what could this mean for United States policies? Let's bring in our panel to discuss all of this. Here in the studio, Eleanor Clift is a political analyst for the Daily Beast and a veteran in coverage of U.S. politics. Lester Munson is... Need some water? We'll get you some water.
I have some water.
Mr. Munson is a principal in the International BGR Group, a leading government relations firm here in Washington. He has also served on Capitol Hill as a chief of staff in both the Senate and the House. Joining us from Los Angeles, Ahmed Younis is an international security program fellow at New America and a former senior official at the U.S. State Department. Also with us in the studio, Song Zhang is the Washington bureau chief for the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. Welcome to all of you. Eleanor, I'm going to start with you so we can get this out of the way. You can get some water. These threats have been floating around of a government shutdown that could happen by Friday. That means if there is a shutdown, that there is no money for the, I guess, day-to-day operations of government, right?
Well, it's a partial shutdown because most of the government has been funded. There are half a dozen appropriations bills that need to be passed. And so some critical parts of the government, like the Justice Department, would shut down. Something like 340,000 people would be affected. Now, it's not a full shutdown where the Washington Monument would be closed to tourists and Social Security checks wouldn't go out. So the theory is that the president would do it to make a point for a few days over Christmas. But it's disaster for the people who are affected, and it's a disaster politically. And the Republicans had spent weeks laying the groundwork to call any shutdown over the wall funding the Schumer funding, which would be named after the Democratic leader. And in that encounter you showed, President Trump owned, it's my shutdown, and Republicans are very upset. Nobody really wants the shutdown, and he does not have the votes on the Hill. So if he carries it through, the Democrats will pass the bills in question as soon as they take over the first week of January. And the president might want to veto it, he will be overridden. So he really doesn't have any leverage here.
All right, let me bring in Ahmed Younis. He's in Los Angeles. Ahmed Younis, immigration, of course, has been a big talking point during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, especially talk about this wall that President Trump wants to build on the southern border. We have negotiations that have been going on in Congress for a very long time, but so far nothing has been agreed. But if you look at some of the recent polling, 65% of Republicans say that the president should not compromise on building the wall, even if it means a shutdown. And last Sunday, one of President Trump's key advisors, Stephen Miller, outlined to a U.S. television network on what the White House is planning to do on the immigration issue. Let's watch.
We're going to do whatever is necessary to build the border wall to stop this ongoing crisis of illegal immigration. The Democrat Party has a simple choice. They can either choose to fight for America's working class or to promote illegal immigration. You can't do both.
So, Ahmed, this seems to be an obsession with the president, the construction of this wall. There are better, less expensive ways of maintaining security without the wall. So why is this president so fixed on the wall?
because it's a promise that he made and specifically articulated in the campaign, and it has become an ego issue or an issue of egotism in that he has to follow through with that promise. The distinction that we have here between Stephen Miller's ideology, which the president is consistent with, which is primarily anti-immigrant, anti-immigration, and the criminalizing of innocent people who are attempting to seek asylum in the United States, it's juxtaposed against the political feasibility of a border wall, of an immigration policy that criminalizes innocent people, and is, contradicted by the lack of willingness among Republicans to push through. Much of what President Trump argues for is ideologically satiating for the base. But when it becomes law or when it becomes to affect their personal lives, you see the president, as he has done with the shutdown, backtrack in order to save what he perceives to be votes in the future.
Lester, the budget, passing a budget rather, the wall, they're all interconnected.
Right.
Here's something that people around the world might find difficult to understand. We have this threat of a shutdown every few weeks.
Yeah.
Why can't the government pass a budget for a year like other countries do?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who would like to do that, but there are plenty of political forces in the U.S. that act directly on the budget process. Both parties have vested interests in various parts of the budget, and they're willing to fight for the things they believe in. And it comes to a head in the U.S. through these, what we call government shutdowns. It's really not a government shutdown. I think if you do the math on the amount of money that the U.S. government spends, only 7% of the government will be shut down if, in fact, we don't pass these bills by Friday. So it's really pretty small at this point. It's not your father's government shutdown the way it used to be back in the 90s when it really was catastrophic. This is going to be pretty thin. Not many people will notice. And frankly, I think even the people who do won't be that upset by it. I think the reason you're seeing the change in the White House is the president, I hope, has realized that the immigration issue has very limited utility for him. If he paid attention to the election in November, he saw that his use of the caravan and all of these other kind of dramatic foils to bring forth the immigration issue didn't work very well for his party. And a big part of the reason that the Democrats took over the House is because the Republicans didn't have a good argument. Immigration is not a great way to win a national election. So I hope this means he's shifting away from the immigration issue, and he should be focusing on things like the economy, where he's got a pretty good argument. We're at all-time high unemployment numbers, which is very good, including for African Americans and Hispanic Americans. If the president wants to speak to those groups and talk about economic opportunity, he's got a really positive message to tell.
Song Zhang, immigration may not be a big thing for the president politically, as Lester just told us, but we see these pictures of the caravan at the border. We see some of the people trying to get across the border, people arrested. We had the story last week, a very tragic story of a 7-year-old child from Guatemala, child that died after being detained. How is the world viewing all of this?
I think most of the people in China and other countries are looking at this issue as like humanitarian issue. This kind of poor people from South America should be allowed to come in. But some people also can smell the kind of way the Republicans and President Trump are looking at this issue. They believe that the White House has a reason to believe to believe those kind of people may bring some chaotic situation or to some extent drugs. And Chinese people, I don't know whether we have a kind of very united idea, but basically people believe this is a humanitarian issue.
Eleanor, let's move to Congress. And as I mentioned earlier, the Democrats will assume power in the House of Representatives. That's one of the two houses in Congress. What does that mean?
Oh, it means that the president and his cabinet will be getting oversight investigation. In other words, various cabinet officials and their policies will now be examined in a way that they haven't been. You could have potential hearings into what's called the emoluments clause, which is in the Constitution, where the president is benefiting off of his position. So there will be lots of investigation and subpoenas now that the Democrats have subpoena power. But they will also be legislating, and I think they want to lead with legislating. They want to do election reform. They want to protect Obamacare. They want to do an infrastructure package. So this is a chance for the Democrats to get ready for 2020 and to build a roadmap for the nominee who will challenge President Trump for re-election in 2020. So they need to legislate and show what they can do for the American people if they gain the White House.
Yeah, so they can't just be the party of no, just blocking everything all the time.
No, they're going to be the party of yes, and they're going to send it over to the Senate, and the Republican-controlled Senate will probably say no to a lot of things. But there'll be some things that they might want to say yes to. This last election, the Democrats won largely because they ran on protecting health care and protecting coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. And Republicans all say they're now for it. So they're going to pass that and test the Republicans. You know, is the rhetoric real?
Yeah.
So, and infrastructure, the president has actually said he does want to work on this country needs bridges and needs a greener, more climate friendly structure in many areas. So there's room to work there too, also between the Democrats and the president.
Lester, how worried should President Trump be over these new powers now acquired by the Democratic Party?
Well, it's both a threat and an opportunity for him. The threat is exactly as Eleanor says. There's going to be a lot of subpoenas flying to him and to his administration. There will be investigations. There will be hearings on TV. There will be some embarrassing revelations, I'm sure. But it also gives the president something to push back against. And if the Democrats go too far in their investigations, or if they're too harsh in their criticism, or if they're too knee-jerk in their opposition to some of his policies that might be a little more popular than the others, it gives him a good opportunity to push back against someone. And what he's going to try to do, just as the Democrats are going to try to do, is trot out issues and messages that are going to be good for him in 2020. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle the immigration issue. It'll be interesting to see how healthcare plays out going forward. And then what the president does and what the Democrats do about the economy. I don't know where the Democrats would go to criticize the president on the economy, other than the fact that the stock market is down the last couple of weeks. He's got a very strong message there, and so I think we're going to see a lot of really high-level political jockeying for the next couple of years.
Right. So Ahmed Younis, we have issues like immigration, which the Democrats will no doubt be discussing with their Republican counterparts in Congress. But one of the big issues that became a very big issue right after Donald Trump was elected was collusion with the Russians, or to use the legal term, conspiracy to collude with the Russians. Do you think that's going to be a big thing in the next Congress?
It absolutely will. Much of the discourse in Washington right now is attempting still to unfold what it is exactly that Russian disinformation was attempting to do. We've just learned within the last week that Bernie Sanders supporters were targeted, African-American supporters were targeted. We are still learning what it is that Russia was attempting to do. And yes, it will be a big issue for voters. But I think we have to remember that the bread and butter issues that affect people's daily lives, 41% of midterm voters say healthcare is the #1 issue. The second one, not by a long shot, even close. The American people are still keenly aware that the social structure that they have created within the last 4 to 8 years is being dismantled by the Trump administration, some pursuant to ideology, some pursuant to cynicism, and some pursuant to political ineptitude. And it's smart for the Democrats to continue their focus on improving the daily lives of Americans by protecting election processes, by ensuring that there is health care for those who seek it, by ensuring that United States foreign policy does not continue to mire us in further wars pursuant to a neoconservative ideology towards Iran, etc. So while Russian disinformation is a major issue, while no doubt Russia is continuing to attempt to influence American public opinion and sow discord and chaos among us, bread and butter issues will always carry the day for the American voter.
You know, Ahmed Younis, you mentioned healthcare. In fact, all of you have mentioned healthcare. There was just a big spanner thrown in the works just this week when a court actually ruled against the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, saying that the government cannot legally force people to pay premiums for this kind of healthcare. How big an issue is that?
It's a major issue. Actually, for all the fascinating reasons of Washington, Senator Cornyn, Senator Lamar Alexander immediately went to the airwaves and said to their constituents, don't worry, your coverage continues while the appeal process continues. No one is rooting for this decision. Many legal scholars are saying that it will likely be overturned. But there is not yet a politically feasible alternative to the Affordable Care Act. And until the Republican Party is able to conjure up some sort of viable alternative, they will always be faced with the proposition that they are taking away entitlements for the American voter. And when you do that, you usually lose elections.
How does Congress overcome a decision that's made by the other branch of government, the judicial branch, basically?
Well, first of all, this was a single judge in Texas, and it then goes to the larger circuit, so more judges get involved. It might not survive. Ultimately, if it goes to the Supreme Court, I think Justice Roberts, he's the Chief Justice, and he saved Obamacare initially, and I think he has a keen sense of how history will regard the court, and I don't think he wants to the court to go down in history taking away health care from millions of people on a rather dubious ruling. So I don't think it'll get that far, but if it did, I think it would be the end of the Republican Party as we know it, because it would create such havoc. Now, Congress can intervene. The judge said, since the Trump administration took away the mandate, which was a tax, therefore it's unconstitutional. Congress could restore the tax, have every American pay $1, and that would be fixed. That would be the easiest fix you could do. So I think people in both parties don't want Obamacare to go away. It finally is popular after many years.
Right. It's been solved right now. Lester, I want to ask you one question on something that we were talking about with Ahmed Younis a moment ago, and that is the Russia investigation. Do you see it become a huge, big investigation in Congress with the Democrats in the House?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by the Russia investigation.
Well,
the investigation,
it's so wide.
It's become such a. There are now so many investigations into so many aspects of President Trump and his private life and his political life, his inaugural committee. I mean, it's hard to limit it just to the Russia investigation. It does seem like if you consider the totality of the legal challenges to the president, they're quite daunting. And there's the special counsel, Robert Mueller in particular, has been very successfil in getting convictions and guilty pleas, and people have gone to prison.
But not on collusion, right?
But not on the collusion part. Although it is amazing how this story does not go away, and a lot of these meetings during the campaign and otherwise have had different stories told by different people about why they happened and what was discussed. And inevitably, whether there's a conspiracy or not, as we all know, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. It's going to be the lies that were told about those meetings that are going to come back to haunt people.
Okay, Song, let's get back down to earth. President Trump often talks about how well the stock market is doing. It hasn't been doing well so recently, but he has been talking about how well it's been doing under his administration. As I said, Tuesday, the market rebounded after a big sell-off on Monday, but the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, he was not impressed, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
It would be very surprising to see it sort of stabilize here and then take off again. But it's happened in the past. However, at the end of that one, run for cover.
So given the problems that the United States is facing now, especially in its trade dispute with China, what's the outlook?
Of the stock market or economy?
For the US, yeah.
I think I don't understand why President Trump has given too much attention to the stock market performance. I think many people will believe that the stock market of America is already on peak, and it's very difficult for it to gain much more. But I will say basically U.S. economy is doing all right. The trade dispute with China and many other countries are there, but until now, the damage to U.S. economy is all right, and I think Trump will have to consider to have more trade deals with China and European countries maybe in the next year. And I think if that will happen, U.S. economy can remain I think regular kind of development GDP will be growing at the rate of 2.5%. That's a good one, but Trump seems to be much more ambitious. He wanted to see it to be like 3, 4, even 5, 6%, which is not making sense to me.
Not realistic. Ahmed Younis, there is one group of people in the United States feeling the effects of Trump's trade war with the Chinese, and those are farmers, mainly farmers in the Midwest. Exports have dropped. The federal government has had to step in to make up the shortfall in earnings for those farmers. And many of those farmers, of course, export soybeans to China. China has, of course, found other sources for soybeans right now. Will there be a political cost for Trump, despite the fact that the government is trying to make up those shortfalls?
Well, there's anecdotal evidence that Trump supporters who are farmers are willing to bear the brunt of some of the repercussions of this trade war. Well, one must point out that government subsidies to industries that are not succeeding because of the current legal environment is not necessarily free market capitalism and the competition that conservatives claim to believe in ideologically. Having said that, again, when people's lives are affected in an immediate way, their ideological affiliation to the political parties that they have always supported comes under stress. If they have always been in a poorly disposed economically, they tend to vote against their interests throughout their lives. If they have not, if they are newly disadvantaged in the economy, there seems to be a sense of awareness among voters that say, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to reconsider our relationship with the Republican Party and with the Trump administration.
Listen, how big a risk is this for the president? Because with these tariffs that he's imposing on Chinese imports, at some point we're going to see prices go up pretty seriously in this country for commodities. That's going to hurt him, isn't it?
Sure, and if he pushes too hard, and if he continues to use tariffs and not other means of competing with China, yes, I think you will find that it will return not what he's hoping for. But I think we have learned some things in the last couple of years. One is that modest tariffs or moderate tariffs are not necessarily a bad tool to use in a dispute with another country. And I'm not talking about President Trump's dispute with Canada, where I found it a little confusing. But I think the president's approach to China, based on tariffs, is actually quite popular with the American people. It's got support in both parties in Congress. And when Republicans wanted to challenge his authority to implement tariffs, it was a Democrat, it was Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who defended him in the Senate. So I think we should not underestimate how powerful the politics are for the president of this tariff issue. I think it's one of the things he's going to shift to away from the immigration issue as he gets into 2020, because he'll see that it's going to reap better rewards for him.
Song Zhang, how does China respond to that?
I think China definitely believes the two countries will both lose if we have continuing this tariff war. But I think basically I agree with you that till now the tariff action is quite popular in America. But if he will go much further to charge like 200 billion or even 260 billion Chinese goods to like 25% tariff, that will be quite different. And we may see a lot of commodities in Walmart to be much more expensive. Whether President Trump is willing to take that risk, it's not certain.
All right. Eleanor, let's move to something else now, and that is a staffing problem that the president has. His chief of staff, that's a key position in the White House. Right. John Kelly will be leaving. The president is having some difficulty filling in that position.
Well, he appointed an acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who is a former member of Congress, who is also the budget director and who also for a time was leading the Consumer Protection Bureau. And so the president finds a few loyalists, and he kind of cannibalizes his own administration to fill key jobs. And yes, I think people are looking at the state of this White House and wondering if it makes sense to go into it now when they know there's going to be a lot of lawyering ahead and subpoenas, and you might have to get your own lawyer, and people get bankrupted sometimes if they're just peripheral figures. So there are going to be more changes, more cabinet changes. Some people leaving because they don't want to go through the investigative process. The Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Commerce might leave also because he likely would be a subject of congressional investigation. So the president is his own chief of staff. He's his own press secretary. I mean, he and his phone and his tweets, you know, basically are the core of this government.
Lester, when we see all these movements, this is the third, I think, secretary, at least chief of staff that the president will be having in the first 2 years of his administration. That's quite a turnover, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a relatively high turnover, and I think it's notable that there has been that much turnover, but it's not totally unusual. President Obama had an acting chief of staff. He brought back his Senate Chief of Staff Pete Rouse, I think, to hold that job when he couldn't find a permanent person right away. It's not unprecedented for there to be this kind of churn. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I think he's going to end up with, hopefully, with someone much like President Obama ended up with Dennis McDonough, very capable chief of staff who not only believed in his boss but also helped him execute things in a good way. I hope President Trump ends up with someone like that. It'd be good for the country if he had someone who was both a loyalist but also able to act in Washington in a way that's constructive for everyone.
And Lester, just to clarify something, a chief of staff is not someone that just runs the machinery of the White House. A chief of staff has a big role in policy.
A chief of staff really is the gatekeeper to the president, and anything that goes to the chief executive has to go through the chief of staff, which means that person's involved in all aspects of government, and the person also has to be a very good spokesperson for the president. I think one of General Kelly had a lot of terrific qualities. One of them was not his ability to go on TV and articulate a good message for the administration. I suspect the president is looking for someone who can go on TV and express his views in a positive way. Mick Mulvaney will do a decent job, and it's possible he gets the job on a more permanent basis, but I think he's looking for someone who can really spread the word on his favorite medium, which is television.
Right. Ahmed Younis, of course, the president still has 2 years of this first term of his administration to go. What do you see happen in the 2 years ahead? I mean, he's got a lot on his plate. I mean, he's going to have to deal with, as we've just been talking about, the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives and all these investigations that could happen. He's got the immigration issue. He's got the health issue. He also wants to run for election again. So will he be focusing a lot on that campaign?
He's also got an acting chief of staff that called him a horrible person, which is not a great way to enter the next 2-year period. Of course, number one, President Trump is concerned about the Mueller investigation, concerned about exposure for himself and for his family. As you can see, continuing to play chess with the Flynn case, as well as others, attempting to sway public opinion, pursuant, I think, to the proposition that it becomes politically unfeasible for the campaign to continue. Number two, President Trump is going to begin to worry about what's happening on the Hill. NBC News polling reports a decline in interest among the general public for impeachment proceedings. That doesn't mean that you can't have Congress make life just very, very difficult. When I became a senior official in government, I was amazed as an outsider initially at the amount of oversight that the Hill has over executive agencies, at the amount of concern that senior government officials have about what the Hill thinks about what they're doing, how the Hill will engage in oversight over what they're doing, and whether the Hill will support spending for their work. So the second thing is being concerned about the Hill. The third, of course, is the culture wars.
Right.
And President Trump has insisted that he will be a leader on the right in those culture wars.
I've got to go.
And the Democratic Party is moving to the left.
Okay, right, we've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being here. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.